Hello, everyone. Welcome to another weekly Centre for Global Higher Education webinar. I'm Lee Rensimer from University College London. I'll be the chair for today's session. Today, we'll be hearing from Cristina Mazzero. Cristina is a PhD candidate in sociology and social research at the University of Trento, Italy. She's a rising scholar and expert on forced migration in academic settings and on institutional provision and policy with respect to displaced students, including academic freedom. So today, Cristina will be presenting her doctoral work on Italian universities' accommodation of displaced students, looking at how or whether institutional capacity is shaped through inclusion policies. So we're looking forward to hearing from her and subsequently, of course, from you, the audience. But first, before I hand over, just a few brief housekeeping points to mention in case this is your first CG webinar. So firstly, this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted online on the CG website in due course. And a transcript of the chat function is also usually posted, I believe. So will the slides following the presentation. Secondly, please keep yourself muted unless you've been asked to speak or to ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar. You're welcome to, of course. But please do turn it on when asking a question. We recommend using the speaker view setting in Zoom so that you can clearly see who's talking. But to ask a question, the best way to do it would be to put your question in the chat function. Drop your question there first, and then at the end of Christina's presentation, I'll call on you to ask your question directly to her. And if you can't for some reason because of connection, then I'm happy to also ask it on your behalf. So I believe that's all for housekeeping. I'm now going to pass over to Cristina to present her work. So Cristina, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, I guess you can see it.
We do. Great, thanks.
Okay. Ooh. Okay, so thank you, Lee, for the introduction, and thank you also from my side to everybody for joining this webinar today, especially because it's late July, so I really appreciate it. What I'm going to present here today is the preliminary results that are coming from my PhD research, which aims at analyzing the presence of displaced students in higher education in Italy, and also to understand what is the implication of having this category of students for university institutions. So before going into the detail of the presentation, I just want to provide you a brief overview for a roadmap for the next 25 minutes or so. I will first start from the theoretical background, actually, of the work, because I also wanted to contextualize better maybe what can be the contribution of this presentation to the webinar series that the Center for Global Higher Education is organizing on geopolitics of higher education. Then I will dive more specifically into the research aim and rationale and the methodology, and then I will take the last part of the presentation to discuss with you what are the preliminary findings so far, but also the reflection and the potential contribution of the work. So the starting point of my work is the discussion of forced migration in higher education. I think we can all say that this is not a new phenomenon at all, but historically we can count many examples, especially because of the special nature of university institutions that are rooted in the principle of autonomy and academic freedom. However, if we look at the literature on the topic, we can see a sort of evolution of how scholars and academia has analyzed the phenomenon. So in the past years, the focus was more on scholars and the somehow romanticized figure of the exiled academic. And when we talk about this, I think we immediately think about Hannah Arendt or Edward Said. But recently, and especially in the European context, after the so-called refugee crisis in 2015, I would argue that the scholarly attention has shifted towards student displacement and student experiences of forced migration. Because of its nature, I would also say that forced migration in higher education finds itself somehow at the intersection between two well-renowned streams of literatures on higher education studies on one hand, and migration and forced migration studies on the other. the presence of students with a background of forced migration has been deeply analyzed in migration study, especially in the recent years through dedicated publications and conferences. And I would say that the focus has been more on the access and participation inequality, on the issue of integration, but also community belonging and policy implications. For what concerns instead higher education studies, despite the attention is growing, the topics still remain somehow at the margins of the literature. There have been some initial discussion and initial work on the impact that forced migration have on internationalization processes. And here we have some example of some work. Engie and colleagues, for instance, they work on the Turkish context and argue that in that case, we can talk about forced internationalization, for instance, because the Turkish academia had to face the displacement of Syrian refugees. And so for this external situation, they were forced somehow to internationalize in front of this also humanitarian crisis. For what concerns instead more internationalized contexts and so also Western context, Streitweiser and colleagues instead suggest adding a new national to internationalization and talking about humanitarian internationalization. So for instance, they argue that considering the economic, political, or sociocultural rationale for internationalization, as the literature usually do, does not account for the increasing involvement of university institutions in integrating and including students with a background of forced migration. In higher education study, finally, we also have development of study that works more on the policy aspect, and so on the development by university institutions of dedicated initiatives and programs for refugee students. And the contribution of my work today would like to go in that direction. So the aim of the research is to explore the extent to which and how the inclusion of students with a background of forced migration redefine the mission, the pedagogical strategies, and the internal organization of university institutions in Italy. In doing so, this work takes two specific analytical decisions. The first one is to focus on dedicated programs and initiatives that the universities have been implemented since 2015 for this category of students. And this is what I call provisionally university provisions for displaced students. And here I argue that the analytical relevance of talking about programs and dedicated initiatives is because they are the most tangible expression of institutional commitment toward the inclusion of this category of students. The second analytical decision that I'm making with this work is to switch and to move from the concept of refugee students to the one of displaced students. With the term displaced students, I identify a specific category of students who were either forced to leave their country or are unable to return because of situations of generalized violence or targeted persecution, and are now enrolled in university institutions in the receiving countries. So this category also allows me to go beyond the legal status of refugee or asylum seeker to include also a multiplicity of situations and that are also changing over time. And so to enlighten maybe more gray area and gray situation within the broader phenomenon of student displacement. Just a brief contextualization of the context of analysis. So as I was mentioning before, the focus is on the Italian context, which is generally an understudied context in higher education, especially in the study of internationalization, but still can provide some interesting insights also in comparative perspective. Here I just want to mention few elements to better frame the discussion. So in Italy, internationalization reforms were mainly inspired top-down by the Bologna process and by the will also of the university institutions to align with the European partners and colleagues to increase also their attractiveness for international students. However, internationalization reforms had to negotiate with a reluctant state policies and somehow restrictive migration regimes in Italy, with the results of producing an uneven internationalization in which bigger and more resourceful higher education institutions benefited more of this process of internationalization and increased their attractiveness, while generally smaller university institutions remain behind. This uneven internationalization does not involve only the institutions, but also the degree levels and the disciplines. So according to the more recent data, generally master level and PhD level courses are the most internationalized, and concerning the discipline, there is a big difference between humanities and hard science. Within this scenario, it's also interesting to notice that actually Italy made big steps for the inclusion of displaced students in higher education. According to to the report of the European Commission, Italy is the only Southern European country, together with Portugal, to have established national level measure since 2015 for the inclusion of refugee and refugee-like students. At the same time, despite this commitment, today there is no available national level statistics on the scale and the characteristics of the phenomenon, even though some data collection are going on now. And also there is no comparative analysis of the university provision that institutions have implemented so far. So also this work would like to try to fill this gap, which is both empirical and theoretical, I would say. Today's presentation is guided by these two research questions. The first is, of course, more descriptive, and the aim is to understand what are the types of university provisions for displaced students that has been implemented by Italian university institutions in the period between 2015 and 2023, while the second one goes more into an analytical direction and want to understand how and if university provision for displaced students impact on the institutional capacity of the Italian higher education institutions. Since I mentioned the concept of institutional capacity, I just want to briefly mention how I understand and operationalize this concept. And in doing so, I rely on the article that you see quoted here by Domorenoc and colleagues, in which they define institutional capacity as a set of formal and informal rules, norms, procedure, but also as values, belief, knowledge, and skills. So all these elements are the ones that concur to the implementation and the creation of policy also at the university level. In their article, they also divide institutional capacity along 3 levels: the individual one, the organizational one, and the systemic one. And also for more analytical clarity, I will follow this distinction in the presentation of my preliminary findings. Just a brief mention of the research design that is guiding this work. So for this research, I adopted a qualitative multi-methods research design, which is driven by an abductive logic of inquiry. So which is based on a constant dialogue between theory and data in a more systematic way. To select the case studies, I adopted a 2-step selection process. So in the first step, I selected 9 Italian public higher education institutions according to the criteria you can see listed here. And because of the selection criteria, I think it's also important to mention that I ended up selecting big Italian higher education institutions, which are on average more resourceful and more internationalized. In the second stage, for each university institutions, I conducted both documentary research and semi-structured interviews with university personnel, and this stage is still ongoing. Moving on to the findings, I first want to provide a descriptive description of what are the types of university provision for displaced students. And I would like to start from the definition that I'm using for now about this specific type of programs. So by university provision for displaced students, I mean financial and or in-kind support offered by universities to enable displaced students to pursue higher education. Generally, they are identified through specific administrative acts, such as public selection call, but also dedicated information on the university websites. According to these criteria, my research identified throughout the 9 university institutions, 62 university provisions for displaced students in the period under analysis. And from the data that I collected, it is possible to identify 3 types of provisions: services, monetary scholarships, and full developed programs. Services pretty straightforward, includes specific services that the university institutions has implemented, which targeted specifically displaced students. So refugee, asylum seeker, then it depends on the case, but this specific target is made explicit. And here we can, for instance, we talk about specific psychological support, specific academic support, and dedicated student contract. The second type of university provision is the monetary scholarships. So they are pretty straightforward also in this case, economic support specific dedicated to displaced students. They are usually one-time provision, and they often target specific group of students, maybe identified through citizenship or the broader label of student at risk. The third types is what I called full developed program, which actually combine the two type of provisions before that you can see above. So they are dedicated program for displaced students that combine both economic support and dedicated services, both within and beyond the universities. So these are the most complete provisions that the university institutions in Italy are now providing for this category of students. As you can see, we can identify a sort of gradient of complexity throughout these three types of university provision, in which the full developed program is the one which that reveal like a higher level of complexity because it is highly structured, it relies on external partnership and also shared fundings among all the partners. However, I think it's also interesting to notice that this increasing complexity, which also reflects an increasing commitment of the university in including displaced students in higher education, is also accompanied by, for instance, more strict entry requirements and renewal requirements for the benefits. So what I mean for this, usually full developed programs have higher entry requirements in terms of grades, selection process, and also higher renewal requirements. So for keeping the benefits, students have to gain a generally higher amount of credits compared to students with that are benefiting from other kind of provisions. Also, since these programs are quite demanding, both economically, but also from a workload perspective for university institutions, usually they targeted a smaller amount of students. So as you can see, in this gradient of complexity, we can also see that in full developed program, universities are taking more committed to include displaced students in university, but at the same time, they have higher expectations in terms of selection, but also of performance throughout the studies compared to the one of the monetary scholarship of the services. And I think this is a point that we can pick up later on. Besides this descriptive overview about the type of provision, I think it's also important to look at the chronological dimension of how this provision has developed throughout the years. And this is just a quantitative summary of the development of the different provisions throughout the academic years. And as you can see from the year 2020, 2021, we can see like a steady increase of the university provision in the 9 universities selected. And the stronger increase, we have it in 2 academic years specifically. The one is 2021, 2022, and the second one is 2022, 2023. Here is important to mention that it was the period in which 2 important geopolitical crises, of course. So first we have the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan in 2021, and then we have the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian government in 2022. So the increase in the scholarship that in the provision that you can see here is a direct response of the Italian university institutions to geopolitical situation. And this is a strong also signal for responsiveness towards this kind of crisis. After this more descriptive overview of the university provision for displaced students, I want to delve more into how these provisions actually impact on Italian university institutions. I will start from the individual level. So according to the typology I showed you before, at the individual level concern more the competencies, the skill, and the expertise. And what I gained, especially from the interview data, is that university provisions actually allow higher education institutions to capitalize, first of all, on sensitivities and values that are already there. So this kind of project give academic but also administrative personnel the chance to be invested in something they believe on in their work time. So as you can see from the quotation here, implementing this kind of programs gave people the opportunity to express a desire that maybe they had within themselves, but not in their free time, but within their work. The second interesting aspect that happened at the institutional capacity at the individual level is the fact that university provision allowed higher education institutions to value and develop specific competencies and improve services. For what concerned the competencies, this was revealed to be particularly true for the administrative personnel, because dealing with the specific category of students made them also look at international students differently, and also being aware that behind the often unproblematic idea of academic mobility of students, there are more complex migration trajectory, but also they were able to deal better with displaced students more broadly. But despite specific competencies for including displaced students, including this category of students in university in some cases also open up an internal conversation, an internal reflection on how maybe these specific services that at the beginning are thought for displaced students can be applied also for students or international students more broadly. So this is also a chance for university to think about their roles and the services they provide to students. However, also the interview also revealed two downsides and two problematic aspects. The first one is that administrative and practical burdens related to the inclusion of displaced students remain deputized to few good-willing employees. So the fact that university provision capitalize on sensibilities that are already there, it's problematic, because then if the projects are not enough institutionalized, the burden remains on few people who work extra hour to meet the need of the displaced students. But also what it's interesting to notice is that these competencies remain often provision specific. What I mean by that? When I interview, for instance, both academic and administrative personnel, because I know they are involved in some specific program that university is implementing, I always also ask, for instance, about the other programs that the university institutions are implementing. And often, usually the answer that I get is that they don't know. So this means that the competencies that they acquire on one specific project for one category of specific displaced students is not used, is not capitalized by universities when they want to adopt, to provide another kind of provision or to implement another kind of project. And this also is problematic because it reveals that there is no transferability of competencies in this case. Moving on now to the organizational level. Here, organizational level is understood as a set of institutional arrangements and procedures to enhance collaboration and coordination among different actors. And for this presentation, I wanted to focus only on external actors. So how university institutions actually interact with external third-party actors thanks to these university provisions. And data, both documentary research, but also the interview, showed that university provision actually increased the engagement of Italian universities with government bodies, private sectors, and NGOs at different scale. So we can say that university provision actually increased the spatial embeddedness of university institutions. However, this spatial embeddedness does not occur at the same with the same intensity across all levels of the geographical scale. What happened is that university provision for displaced students open up the university to the local level. strengthening the relationship and the collaboration with local NGOs, but also public administration. And this allowed them to create, for instance, specific agreements to meet students' need. At the same time, there is also, as we can notice, somehow a slight increase in the national level, in the importance of the national level networks. So university institutions, while they include displaced students, they also find a chance to engage more with other university institutions in Italy to exchange especially good practices and also to understand together how to overcome maybe some difficulties, while the international embeddedness of university institutions remain quite limited. Despite this data, once again, what it also emerges is that the spatial embeddedness and specifically the local embeddedness of university institutions remains also in this case provision specific. So the collaborations and the agreements that maybe are stipulated between the universities and third partners, either public administrations or NGOs, remain specific for that kind of provision. And when the university has to implement maybe new provisions or different provision for displaced students, these kind of agreements are not activated. And this was often the case for emergency scholarship after the Afghan crisis or the Ukrainian war. So in this case, once again, this project does not allow the university to transfer the competencies, but also the network that they activate. The last level that I want to analyze for concerning the institutional capacity is the systemic level. And here, as you can see, the systemic level of the university includes both policy instruments and techniques, but also policy idea and values. And concerning this broader dimension, I argue that university provisions for displaced students differ along two dimensions. The first one, which regards more policy instrument and procedure, concerns the level of institutionalization. So the presence of a solid normative and operational framework with clear roles, institutional responsibility, and structural monitoring. So in this case, we can have university provision that can have a higher level of institutionalization and some other that can have a lower level of institutionalization. And this is also, it's really provision specific. So also within the same university, we can have different levels of institutionalization. While the second dimension concerns more the policy values and idea that are underlying this university provision. And once again, different provisions express different kinds of value of the university institutions. And this different kind of value can be divided into two main logic, the performative logic on one hand and humanitarian logic on the other. So by performative logic, I mean the predominance of values and discourses that are developed around the idea of merit and deservingness, talent, success of the educational career. And here we can find the idea of the talented student who find himself or herself in a difficult situation. And so the university institution is entitled to help him or her. And the quotation that you can find here is just an example of this kind of performative logic. So here the focus is on the deserving student, and very often this performative vocabulary is also associated with accountability issues. So the fact that university institutions emphasize more this idea of talent and deservingness is also meant to be a way to appear more accountable, both to the governance of the university, but also to external partners and the external part more broadly. And this is becoming even more and more important nowadays, also because of the political situation in Italy, which is not that welcome towards this kind of project. The second type of policy value that we can find, so on the other end of the continuum, we could say, is the humanitarian logics. And in this case, by a humanitarian logic, I mean the predominance of values and discourses that are developed around the idea of assistance, emergency, and human rights protection. So here, the idea is that in some projects, what is predominant is the idea of helping students in need, regardless of their merit or regardless of their academic career. And the quotation that you can see here from my field notes is actually exemplary of this kind of logic. Because the professor was telling me, we have to consider what conditions these students come from. And if the university is a bridge to get them out, why not? It's still a social role for the universities. So as you can see, the different university provision for displaced students are somehow divided, each of them like expressed with different intensities and to different degrees, one or the other underlying logics. And my impression is that university institutions are still trying to negotiate these two identities, these two logics. And for this reason, what I'm trying to do now, as I was saying, this is still a preliminary analysis of my data, is that I'm trying to develop a sort of analytical framework, an interpretative grid, to better analyze the different university provision for displaced students. So what I'm trying to do here is like to provide this framework to better understand how university provision actually fit into the broader internationalization policies and third mission agendas of the university institutions. And according to the level of institutionalization and to the negotiation between performative logic and humanitarian logic, we can find that the university provision of displaced students can position differently along this kind of continuum. So what I'm showing you here, and I hope it's clear, but again, it's still preliminary, are, for instance, the project that has been implemented for the academic year 2022-2023, which was the year with the highest number of university provision of displaced students. And what I'm trying to do at this stage of my data analysis is try to quantify the qualitative data that I obtained to try to systematize the university provision, also for increasing the comparability between them. These are just indicative value, but I wanted to show you this because I think they can already show a trend in the data and in the kind of university provision. So for instance, what we can find usually in the upper left part of the graph are usually what are identified as full developed scholarship in the sense of university corridors, for instance, because here we have a higher level of institutionalization because there are structured external partnership, there is a structured monitoring, and there is also a really clear and structured financial support. But at the same time, compared to the other kind of university provision for displaced students, they are also expression of stronger performative logic because they have more strict entry and renewal requirements to keep the benefits compared to other programs. On the opposite side of the graph, so in the bottom right part instead, we can find programs which are characterized by a strong humanitarian logic and at the same time by a low degree of institutionalization. And this is the case of all those scholarships that university institutions have been implemented to face the humanitarian crisis. So for this emergency scholarship, for instance, we have a low degree of institutionalization because we have mainly internal fundings. They are not continuous, but usually they are thought as a one-time support. There is no explicit delegate sometimes. There is no monitoring. But at the same time, there are very minimal entry requirements because the logic that underlines this kind of scholarship is the fact that these students have immediate needs and they need immediate assistance. So as you can see, despite they all fall within the framework of university provision for displaced students, this kind of project actually express different goals, different logics, and they are also positioned differently within the university institutions. And this is something that I think we can all reflect more on, both from a more theoretical perspective, but also in a more policy-oriented approach. So trying to sum up the presentation, I want to go back to the initial question, the title of my presentation. So does this inclusion build institutional capacity, or it's the other way around? So does institutional capacity build inclusion? Maybe not so surprising, I would say it's both. So on one hand, implementing university provisions for displaced students increases the institutional capacity of universities at many levels. They develop institutional individual competencies and skills. They develop institutional procedure, and they increase the local embeddedness of university institutions. At the same time, data reveal that there is a lack of transferability of these institutional capacities within the same university. So across projects, sometimes universities fail to capitalize on competencies and skills that are already there, limiting these practices of inclusion to consolidate. For what concern more systemic level, and so like how these kind of projects are framed within the broader mission of the university institutions, we can see that is at place constant negotiation between two kind of logics, the performative one and humanitarian one. And so what emerged, in my opinion, is a sort of ongoing struggle of university institutions to balance equity on one hand, because they want to include a population that is considered vulnerable and super disadvantaged compared to others, but at the same time, they have to face accountability instance. And so this is also why sometimes the performative logic is stronger, because this can legitimate more this kind of commitment. Of course, I cannot conclude without mentioning the limitation of this kind of work, which is mainly related to the fact that we are talking about a quite small population and a small reality, and at the same time we are moving in a context in which there is no systematic data, not even at the university level sometimes, so, and not even at the national level. But despite that, I think that still thinking about student displacement in higher education can provide some interesting points of conversation and interesting insights to both in terms of more policy-oriented research, but also in terms of theoretical reflections. So I think that what this research is trying to show is that universities, of course, are embedded in the social fabric of individual states, and they are responsive to complex and the changing phenomenon of forced migration. So these university provisions are actually a response to changing geopolitical situations. And this, I think, that raise some questions and open some points for discussion. Like considering more policy-oriented research and the university institutions themselves, I think that including displaced students in higher education push university to rethink their internationalization agenda and maybe think about how to integrate it with more third missions goals, because often they remain kind of separated. For what concern instead more theoretical or academic-oriented research, I think that the reality of student displacement in higher education, but also the current geopolitical situation that is going on at the moment, they call us for a systemic integration of displacement within the framework of internationalization. Because we usually think about internationalization and international student mobility as a mainly unconstrained phenomenon, but instead, this research, but more broadly, the increasing attention on this topic is showing that actually, for instance, internationalization, international student mobility are intertwined with experiences of coercion, of violence, of trauma. And so this calls for a really systematic integration to higher education studies of the concept of displacement. Thank you very much.
Well, Christina, that was fantastic. A truly enjoyable presentation. I think, beautifully laid out, and with some really interesting findings that gives us a lot to think about, a lot to talk about today. I think there's clearly many entry points here that we could talk about with regards to displaced students in the national context of national politics, And of course, as you point out at the end, the geopolitical context as well, all these things happening in very recent years. So there's lots to say, and we have a great audience, actually. I'm surprised we've got some 30 in the audience. So I'm going to ask everyone to begin putting your questions to Christina in the chat. And in the meantime, while she's catching her breath and you're beginning to write your questions, maybe I'll just have a start here thinking about national politics in Italy and some of the changes that we've seen in very recent years with the rise of the Meloni government. Well, I suppose prior to that was the Five-Star Movement. And so you got this turbulent, regressive politics in Italy. Some of it maybe precipitated by the refugee crisis, some of it accelerated by it. And so a lot of political discourse, as you point out, creates a hostile environment for migrants and who's entitled to public services and so on. And also, I suppose it creates tensions with the European Union, is seen as fueling the problem in some way by requiring refugees or asylum seekers to register at the point of arrival, which is inevitably always a sea border country. So I was wondering if you could just talk a bit about the impact of national politics on institutional capacity and some of the programming that you're looking at. Do you see some kind of pressure bearing down from national politics on universities and asking them to respond in certain ways or not respond in certain ways, perhaps?
Thank you for the question. So these are mainly my pickups on the situation. So take it as like a personal consideration, but yeah, definitely the national situation and the national politics, of course, play a role in the inclusion of displaced students in higher education. As I was mentioning before during the presentation, we move in a situation in which, in general, not even talking about displaced students, but international students more broadly, the visa regimes and the migration policies are not that favorable. For instance, like recently, a few months ago, the government raises the tax for the national health system for international students from 100 euros to 700 and more euros per year. And this is also a problem for displaced students who are here on a student visa. So they are also implementing somehow this kind of restrictive policy. And my impression is that university institutions are trying to react to this kind of national level logic with the performative logic I was saying before. So focusing so much on the talent, on the personal academic trajectory, on the fact that these students are really deserving, they are highly skilled, highly educated, they are really deserving of this kind of program, actually allow university institutions to be more accountable towards the government, even when the government is not that favorable towards refugee inclusion more broadly. So I think what we are seeing in the recent years, also looking at how some of the provisions like evolved during times and during the years, is that stronger focus on deservingness and talent. And I mean, I can understand this. And it's, so I think university institutions concerning inclusion of displaced students, they are somehow going into that direction. And this will increase, I think, over time.
So using that the binary framework that you've put forward, then you're suggesting then that the politics are pushing programming into the performative direction, at least in how it presents itself or how it frames itself. Is that correct to say?
Yeah, I wouldn't say maybe it's the government directly, but it's somehow also preventive, so to avoid problem of accountability or restitution of some initiatives, also because, I mean, universities are investing fundings and money on this kind of projects. And sometimes there is the fear of see other people say you are taking away money for other students who are still in need. So you really need to justify this kind of commitment, which is both economic, but also about human commitment, about the academic and university and administrative personnel, which is, I mean, it's quite a lot. So this is definitely something that is happening.
Mm-hmm. So methodologically, I was curious about framing the two as distinct or dichotomous. Is it possible that humanitarian logics and performative logics overlap, and that they're performing a humanitarian logic in some way, or feeling compelled to demonstrate that? I mean, maybe that would be incompatible with the current political context. I don't know, but is it also possible that you might find maybe in other countries those two logics overlapping?
My idea was not to represent these two logic as like two opposite thing, but like I intended them more like as a two poles of a continuum. So like in the middle of this continuum, of course, these performative and humanitarian logic are more mixed, and the differences is more nuanced. So the idea is like that what I presented also from the quotation, for instance, they are like extreme example of this kind of logic, but actually what happened is that many of the projects fall somehow in between. They are trying to keep together at the same time performative instances, but also humanitarians one. So my idea is to frame it more as a continuum, because we definitely like this tension and this overlapping is there. It would be wrong to say that they fit to one of the two boxes. So definitely.
Okay, well, enough questions from me. How about a question from the audience? I see we've got quite a few people here, and some of whom I know here are scholars in refugee and displaced students. Would love to hear some of your thoughts, even if they are reflections from other contexts. Perhaps we could also talk about the geopolitics a bit, some of the current ruptures we're seeing geopolitically. And I guess it's a question of how we. I like that you use the Glynackel framing of things and to look at how things are joined up spatially. In some ways, I suppose it's hard to disentangle them. You know, you have the geopolitical events and spheres that are also driving national politics and national responses to those, and then of course institutions being bound up in them. What's very interesting about your work, though, is how it's demonstrating university actorhood as geopolitical actors or agents. You know, in some ways, forging their own geopolitical foreign policy, if you will, to respond to the crisis. Do you get a sense in your work of universities being sort of independent geopolitical actors?
Maybe independent is a strong word, but for sure, like they try to move within the situation, trying to use also their autonomy, because I mean, university institutions are autonomous institutions somehow, to use the options that are available to maybe develop some kind of geopolitical presence or like some kind of internationalization. So definitely they are trying to move within the constraints that are external, but like so they are trying also to use the tool that they have. For instance, I was thinking about a university in which they used the Erasmus agreement that were already there with Ukrainian universities to facilitate the arrival of Ukrainian students after the war. In other cases, for instance, for Afghanistan, like professors who had like direct research relationship with their with the context there, they used that kind of internationalization that was already there, the research collaboration, to bring students in Italy. And also this kind of internationalization actually shaped their sensitivity toward what was happening in those contexts. So what I don't know if I'm clear enough to say it, but what I think it's also interesting, and maybe would be interesting to see it in a more systematic way. I don't have the data now, but overall, it's how also like broader internationalization agenda actually creates sensitivity and provide the space for university then to intervene in geopolitical situations. And so it's not something that happened in a vacuum or out of the blue, but it's like because university institutions have already in place some sort of relationship, academic relationship, and they use them as a also leverage maybe to then intervene in some situations. So these are also the channels that they are trying to use to intervene and take part also in what's happening in some context.
So earlier we were talking before the webinar began about where your research is at and the fact that you'll be collecting more data. Just wondering if how do you think collecting more data will change the findings that you have so far with respect to what you were just saying? And do you imagine including private universities in that would change the picture in some way, or would that kind of confound things?
Actually, picking up from the last point, my idea was to stick with public universities because they are more, and this allowed me also to better compare the different institutions. So no, for the time being, I'm not planning to include private university because I think they can be pretty different. So I don't want to mix too much the situations. On the other hand, what my idea to open up the sample is like trying to make my results and my interpretation more robust. So what I think I'm going to find is stronger support to these initial trends that I'm seeing in the data. So for instance, also the distinction between performative and humanitarian. So my idea to open up the sample and increase the data collection is trying to make these findings and this trend more robust to see if this is actually there. So these kind of trends are actually shared by other university institutions, or it just also maybe a bias from the fact that I'm still considering like few university institutions which are big, more internationalized, and so of course they are not representative of the whole university institutions. So that is the idea for the second part of the PhD.
I see. Okay. So yeah, I didn't get a sense of that just in your methodology. So this is a nationally scattered sample of universities, but large public universities that are internationalized. Are there any differences within them that might, account for different findings, other than the fact that they're public, they're internationalized, they take on a large number of displaced students compared to private? What else would there be?
I think that the north-south divide still is important, and I still didn't have the time to tackle it properly. But since I used also the geographical position to select the universities, what I noticed is that for geographical reason, universities from the south are dealing with displaced students in a different way than university from the north. So they have a larger population of refugee and asylum seeker students who can actually be enrolled in universities. So their policy for including displaced students are really bottom up in a way, because they start in a really also disorganized way somehow to find way to include them also in a less structured way. So they really have this urgency because it's their position also in the geographical space in Italy. While in the north, there is more, I would say, the program are more structured. There is more like somehow governance will also, or like higher level will of deciding to invest in this kind of project. Because there is a shared sensitivity of the governance, while really in the south it seems to happen more naturally somehow because it's their geographical position there. So this is something I have to, so also thank you for the question. I have to unpack more definitely, but I think it's there. So
That's an interesting distinction then. So the universities in the South are more, I don't want to mischaracterize them as being on the back foot, but responding to the situation more forcefully out of necessity than universities in the North. Is there a big difference in funding and prestige between, or not prestige, I suppose, but funding and resources in the north and the south?
Concern like Italy more broadly, yes. I mean, of course, like a region from the north have more resource overall. So also this also reflects on university institutions, definitely. I'm still talking about big university institutions, so they are on average more resourceful than others. But yeah, this point is definitely there. Yeah, maybe we can. Yeah, I think that the point is that the university from the south actually they have the situation there, so they felt like somehow naturally to try to take a position and try to develop something there. And they also, it's also interesting to notice that their work is also less visible, for instance. Just thinking about the university websites or the dedicated programs, like for me, it was harder to find programs, for instance, because they publicize it less, although they are doing work there. And so this is also a different way of maybe like understanding what they are doing and like also presenting their work. So
one quick clarification then before I hand over to an audience member's question. Then just how do you find out about programs like this then? And do you hear from any of the students themselves in terms of how they found out about resources and opportunities available to them?
so the question is how I found out about programs, yeah?
Yes, and
or how the students do.
I am curious, especially how students find out about it if it's not easy to find on the websites.
Then it depends. Like here, the local dimension is still important once again, because some universities, what they are trying to do is like to spread the news through local NGOs that deal with like refugee hosting, and also so working with the third sector in their cities. And they are trying to sort of also institutionalize this kind of relationship and this kind of support, also to spread the fact that there are this kind of opportunity there. So this is definitely something they are trying to do. And then also at the national level, they're trying to publicize it more. But yeah, also the part about the student is something I would like to develop toward the end of the research. So probably we'll complement the data with the interviews with students, not in all universities, of course, but a couple of them I would like to capture also, of course, their side of the programs and so on. So I think that in that case will be also clearer for me, like how this works.
I see. Good. Okay. All right. Enough from me. Let's go to the audience here. We've got a question from Maria Teresa. Maria Teresa, would you like to ask the question yourself? If so, turn on your video and your mic.
I'm so sorry, but I have my baby boy here, so I just put on the chat my question. Thank you so much.
Oh, okay. I'll go ahead and read it then. So it says, "Thank you, Christina. I found interesting the point about the lack of transferability of knowledge. In your opinion, what role does the Ministry of Education play?" So I'm referring to the fact that the Ministry of Education in Italy does not participate directly in these provisions, nor does it try to systematize and capitalize on what has been produced so far. Can this be a risk or an advantage to engaging more the institutional bodies? And also, is that could that limit academic freedom?
That's a big question. Thank you, Maria Teresa, for the point of discussion. Yeah, definitely there is the fact that there is no structural centralization of this kind of project doesn't help. Also, the lack of transferability both between the universities and also within. So I mean, as Maria Teresa know, of course, there are like national level networks of university institutions that are trying to create a discussion between universities that are dealing with this kind of problem related to the inclusion of displaced students in higher education, to like exchange good practices and so on. But of course, this is not enough. I think that the Ministry of Education might play a role, but what I think it's interesting, and I was trying to highlight it in the presentation, is that this lack of transferability is within the universities. And this is something that I don't think, I mean, the ministry level cannot really deal with. So what I was thinking is that university institutions, especially the big one, are really complex institutions. And when you are doing different things with different people, of course, then there can be the issues of communication and so on. So I think that the first there is a problem internal the university, so that the fact that people who are working on this project don't talk with the other people that are working on similar projects, but maybe with a different category of displaced students. And so this also doubled the work and is not efficient for the university themselves. Then there is, of course, the between university level, and this is something that need to be improved as well, starting from the data collection, I would say, not only about the projects, but also about the students that are present in Italian university. So maybe the role of the Ministry of Education, what would be nice is like to push for a systematic data collection and assessment of the situation within the universities. Then about the limit to academic freedom, I mean, this is a really big point. I don't have an answer for that because I mean it's really complicated to balance the two things. So the fact that like there are already national level networks in which university institutions already share good practices, I think it's important and need to be improved also, because in that space I think that university institutions can really be autonomous in the more precise sense of the term. The Ministry of Education can play a role, but of course, I mean, it's that's why I was thinking more about data collection or like to more coordinating this kind of aspects. Maybe that would be important. At the same time, would preserve maybe the autonomy of the institutions. I mean, it's not just a thought, not a question, but thank you.
That's a great question, great response. There's a lot to think about there. Christina, you've given us really a lot to work with here. This is great. I think we might wind down unless there are no further questions from the audience. I don't know if I see any, because it is now approaching the end of the hour. Okay, all right. Well, yes, I think we're gonna wrap up there. Christina, I want to thank you so much for coming today and presenting your work. It's fantastic, and we'll be following it closely as it develops. I hope you want to return and present once it's all finished.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for sharing. So we'll be posting a recording of the slides and the presentation itself on the CG website later today. So you can find it there and do share with your networks. There's also one final webinar for the summer series, which will be same time next week, from Emily Dobrik, presenting on situated solidarity building within the context of geopolitics. So that's all from us today. Once again, thank you, Christina, and thank you all for joining us today. It's been a great session. Bye for now.
Thank you.